This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
It's great to see you all and a lot of old friends and some new ones. So let me just quickly introduce myself and tell you how the class is going to go, and then we'll dive in. I was teaching a class last fall in Fromm on the directing process, and at the end of it, a number of people in the class said we would like more time just on the plays of Harold Pinter. So that's what we've decided to do. And while this is a class on that dramaturgy, it's not so much a literature class, although we really will analyze the plays, as it is a way to look at these plays as plays, and to explore not only how they work in terms of the language and structure of the plays, but how one might think about staging them. So most of the plays that we are going to work on are plays that I have staged, some of which, if any of you went to ACT over the last 3 decades, you might have seen on the stage of the Geary Theater, or in New York at the Classic Stage Company, which I did before, or maybe at various other places. And so I'll be bringing to you each week some imagery and examples and thoughts, not only, as I say, about the literature, but about the way the plays work in terms of design and staging and casting and all of that rehearsal process. I want to share my screen with you for a moment, and just show you just what the weeks will look like. So I've chosen kind of the 8 plays we're going to focus on. If there's something you really love, particularly any of the one acts or later plays or minor plays that you'd love to hear me comment about, I'm more than happy to do that. This class is for you, but here's how it's going to go. Today, I'm going to give you a kind of overview of Pinter himself, of the man, of his life and work. And next week, we'll start with his first full-length play from 1957, The Birthday Party, which was the last play I directed at ACT, so you may remember that one. The next week week 2 will be The Caretaker, which was his second full-length play, and the play that actually kind of first really put him on the map and ran for a year. And then week 4 is what I think is great masterpieces, The Homecoming, sort of Pinter's King Lear. We did it in about 2010 at ACT. It's an astonishing play. And then Old Times, which is his most kind of feminist, female, kind of homoerotic play, very mysterious and interesting. Again, we did this at ACT probably in about 1998, I think, or 9, with Pamela Reed. Then one of his last and most beautiful and mysterious plays, No Man's Land, which is about 2 old men after the war. And then his probably most famous play, Betrayal, which I'm sure many of you have seen the film of, and I would recommend, if you feel like it, over the next 2 months, you can easily get it. It's on Amazon Prime and Netflix and other things, the David Jones film of Betrayal, which is one of the only good films. There is a film of The Birthday Party by William Friedkin, and it's terrible, but it's sort of funny to look at. And there's a not very good film of The Homecoming, but Betrayal is a remarkable film with Jeremy Irons and Emma Jones, I think. Anyway, no, Patricia. Oh my Lord, I can't remember. And then the last week is Celebration in the Room, which is The Room is his first one act. Celebration is one of his latest one acts. We did it in the Millennium at the Geary, and they're very scabrous and funny plays. So interesting to take a look at. These are just a few additional resources that I thought might be useful for you to have. I'll always have this image up on hand in case you want to go back and look at it. Various Voices collects Pinter's essays, including an essay we're going to talk about today, a very short essay, but absolutely brilliant and seminal, called Writing for the Theater, which is his manifesto of his own work. The great biography of Pinter, Should You Be Inspired, is by Michael Billington, who continues to be a drama critic at The Guardian in London. It's an excellent biography. It's only about 350 pages long, and it was written in 1996. So 20 years really before Pinter passed away in 2008, but really revelatory and useful. And then I just wrote a book on my own experiences of directing the works of Harold Pinter and Tom Stoppard. I've done a lot of book groups on it, and I did a special Fromm masterclass on it, so some of you will remember that. It's easily orderable should you be interested in digging in deeper into any of this material. That's the one for you. And we'll talk about some of the things that are embedded in that book as we go along in our class. And then while I'm still sharing a screen, I'm going to show you 3 very funny photos. So my experience with Harold Pinter started in 1988 when I directed the first revival in New York since its premiere of The Birthday Party. And he sent Lauren Bacall to come see the production. And she was so excited that he came to visit me at the theater I was running, this little dumpy theater on 13th Street in New York, that was called the Classic Stage Company, still is. I'm still involved with that theater all these years later. And he asked me if I would direct The Birthday Party again with a one-act of his called Mountain Language, which he thought could be done in rep with The Birthday Party. And he said if I did it, he would come to New York and work with us in rehearsal. So this is me as a child director in New York in 1988, 89, when Harold Pinter turned up at 13 East 13th Street to begin work on The Birthday Party. This is us outside, and on the left you will see Peter Riegert, who played Goldberg, Daniel Moses Schreier, the sound designer, and Wendy McKenna, who played Lulu. And there's Harold in his absolutely distinctive black turtleneck, standing on the corner. It was a crummy neighborhood in those days, East 13th Street, but we had a remarkable time in the room. And here's Lauren Bacall, who came to the second opening night when my daughter Lexi was only maybe 2 months old. So Pinter goes way back in my family history. And these are some of the old photos. I'm going to show these again when we work on The Birthday Party, with Peter Riegert, David Strathairn, and Richard Reilly on the set at CSC Repertory of The Birthday Party. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this now. Just did everybody could take a peek at that? Yeah. Okay. Many more images to come, but I just wanted you to know what we're going to be looking at. Thank you, Douglas, for the pitch about my book. And here's what I want to say now about reading the plays. You can read them in any form that is congenial to you. They are published in the complete works. So if you want to get these paperbacks, there are 5 of them. They're called The Complete Works of Harold Pinter. They're published by Grove Press in the United States, and they collect them. So for instance, Collected Works 4 has Old Times, which we're going to read, No Man's Land, and Betrayal. So it's a slightly cheaper way to do it and have them all together. But if you want to just have whatever edition you choose, here's the Caretaker as published. This is the American Grove Press edition, but Faber published them first in London. So some of you who've loved Pinter for years might have the original Faber paperbacks. That's totally fine too. I'm not ever going to refer to page numbers. I'll just do act numbers. So it doesn't matter to me which you get. I wish I could give you just the scanned version of all the plays so you didn't have to go get them, but it's totally illegal from a copyright point of view. So I can't do that. But you can, order them on Amazon. If you hate Amazon, you can get them used at Green Apple Books or anywhere you get your used books, or however you'd like to do it. This is the book I put on page 2 of my PowerPoint, which is called Various Voices. This has Harold Pinter did not say much about his work or write much about his work, but the few essays that he did write and the letters, some of the letters that have been allowed to be published, are collected in this edition, which I always find invaluable. I'm going to quote from it today and read you a couple things that he said about his own work. I will tell you the tragedy is that his collected letters not only have not been published, I think they will not be published anytime soon. His executor is his wife, Lady Antonia Fraser. Many of you will have heard of her. She's a famous historian in her own right who has written many books on Mary Queen of Scots and British historical women, but she's very territorial about Pinter's work. And she will not let the letters be published. So when I published my own book, which, sorry, looks like this, I had in the first draft lots of quotes of letters that Pinter had written to me that I thought were really illuminating about how to do the plays. And although Tom Stoppard gave me permission to publish everything he'd sent to me, faxes, emails, letters, notes, etc., I couldn't print any of Pinter's letters, which is a little heartbreaking. And that's just the reality. However, as I said, I did work very closely with Pinter in rehearsal in the fall of 1989. And then subsequently, every time I did a Pinter play, we had a long epistolary relationship, and he was very available to me. And in particular, when we did Celebration, which was the American premiere of that one act, he had planned to come and we were going to do a big Pinter festival, which we did end up doing at ACT. And tragically, for so many reasons, that was we were previewing that play the week of September 11th. And Harold Pinter, who was very political and very opposed to Bush's foreign policy, said that it would be hypocritical of him to come to California, and he couldn't come. And those were before the days we did things virtually. So we did the plays and we did the festival, but without Pinter. And so it's been a great sorrow of mine that he wasn't there for that. But my experience with him is very practical and was very joyful and hands-on. He answered every question kind of brilliantly. And so I'll get to share some of that with you as we go along. So what I'd like to do is start with a little bit of Pinter's own background, in particular his Jewish background, which I think is really germane to understanding the nature of the plays and his experience in the war. We're going to walk through that, and then a lot of his kind of theater influences and literary influences, etc. We'll take a break around 2, so you can go breathe and do what you need to do, get a coffee. I will try to leave 5 to 10 minutes at the end of every class to answer your questions. So feel free to just put them in the chat whenever you like, and I'll look at them in the break or after if there are things that I'm not covering or that you want to know more about that I haven't hit. I'm totally happy. This class is for you. Anything you want to ask, please feel free. So Pinter was born in London, October 10th, 1930, and he died in 2008. That moment is so vivid to me because it was, the year of 2008 of the great crisis in America and in global finances. And he died right over Christmas. And it was very heartbreaking to me. It was such a rough time to be running a theater. And I pulled the Homecoming off the shelf. And I remember the night that he died, which was December 22nd, I think, my husband and I just reading the Homecoming aloud. And I wrote a celebration of his life for the San Francisco Chronicle, which allowed me to really express my gratitude for the way that Pinter had completely changed my life from the day I first encountered his work as an undergraduate in Martin Eslin's class at Stanford. So Pinter was an East End Jew. He grew up in Hackney, which is where poor Jews lived between the wars. His father was a tailor, kind of classic schmata occupation of Jewish immigrants into London and across the world. His family was from Odessa, both his maternal and paternal grandparents, 3 of the 4. The 4th was from Poland. And he was an only child, which is very moving to me. He had a big extended family, loads of cousins, and he always had, Passover and Jewish holidays with the extended family, but he was an only child and very, very close to his parents, which I always found interesting because during the Blitz, so he was, let's say 12, 13, 14, at the height of the bombing of the war. And you should remember, I'm sure you do, that when the Nazis were bombing London, they focused on the East End of London, partly because that's where the docks were and that's where ships were and ship works and munitions factories were, but partly because that's where the Jewish population was, and that was not lost on Hitler. And he was determined to wreak as much havoc as he could on Jews in England. And many Jews had already fled from the 19th century, but right through to the top of the war. And indeed, many Jews who'd fled recently to England were interred during the Second World War in England on the Isle of Man. There's an amazing book that just came out called The Island of Extraordinary Captives, which is about Jews, European Jews who were interred in camps in England during the war. And I say this to remind you that this was, although Churchill, one could say, is the one who, saved the world from Hitler, and the British were the ones who really fought the war. The English, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in England at this time, and a great deal of conflict and antipathy. As a little boy, as a teenager, Hitler was sent with many, many other English children out of London to the countryside, mostly to Cornwall on the coast, to get away from the bombing. For a lot of English children, this is the first time they'd been to the countryside. For some of them, it was a very happy memory. For Pinter, it was a disaster. So a funny thing I'll tell you about Pinter, which was always true, this sounds very strange. He was not a lover of nature. You will never find happy images or positive images of nature in Pinter's plays. They always take place in a room, in a box set with doors. The knock on the door is always a very frightening indication that a stranger, an outlier, an interloper is about to invade the room. And outside the room, there might be the rest of the world. There might be nature. If it is no man's land, there is a lake outside the window with a dead body floating in it. But nature does not appear in any positive way. And it may be because he was a completely urban, Jewish, English child growing up in a very dense neighborhood in the East End of London during the war, in a very oppositional and dangerous time. He is sent away, as I say, to Cornwall, and he's so homesick for his parents, which again struck me when I first met Pinter as so surreal, because he was a very tough, litigious man. He did not seem soft around the edges, but he was desperately homesick, so much so that he found his way home and lived in London during the height of the Blitz, and described many times later on in interviews looking out onto his garden, little narrow garden of a terraced house in Hackney, and seeing bombs dropping or fire in the back garden, and having to go into the shelter with his cricket bat and his latest love poetry going underground. So his was a very fraught childhood. And I would say that being a child of war informed everything that Pinter wrote forever after. You will find images, not just in literal ways of the war, but images of bombing, of violence, of torture, of opposition, of danger, of fear of being invaded over and over again in Pinter's work. On the other hand, he came from a very close and very protective family. And I would say the second theme that runs all the way through Pinter, which is surprising because the plays are in a way very strange and violent, is family. So the tribe, that Jewish tribe that Pinter grew up in, was incredibly important to him. And in ways that were very, very particular. So for instance, this the fact that his father was a tailor and his family came from the clothing business, his mother, Franny Moskowitz, her father was also in the clothing business, Harry Moskowitz, her father, came to England from Odessa, didn't speak a word of English, but started his own pushcart business, and then very successful fabrics and suits business, things like that. And there are jokes about tailoring and clothes and stylishness and suits all the way through Pinter's plays. You know, when we read The Birthday Party, you're going to see that Goldberg says to Meg, turn around a minute, walk down the aisle. I used to be in the business. Or he'll say, you know, wear this dress, take my tip. So all of those things, that was very much part of Pinter's childhood, the sort of family business. They were also a family, although they couldn't afford books, that revered reading and knowledge. This is a trope that goes back throughout the Jewish diaspora, right? So you will find this again and again in Jewish American writing, whether it's Malamud and Philip Roth and Arthur Miller, indeed, or, you know, I mean, Jewish writing throughout the diaspora, because Jews have always been a wandering people. We have tended to leave behind not architecture, but language and books. Amos Oz writes about this at great length, the Israeli writer. And a reverence for language and a kind of Talmudic sense of study was a big part of Pinter's childhood. He went to the Hackney Downs Elementary School and high school, which is interesting because it was a very rigorous school, but a free school for poor children. But the intake was 50% Jewish because that was the neighborhood. And very studious. In fact, lots of famous Jews who went on to do great things came out of the Hackney Downs, you know, school, including Stephen Berkoff, another Jewish playwright whom Pinter knew and who was roughly Pinter's contemporary. And he had this wonderful teacher called Joseph Brearley, and he revered him. He talked about him later in his life, and they used to take long walks through the Hackney Downs, and they would recite English poetry and plays. And the one he particularly loved was The Duchess of Malfi and Jacobean drama. So that kind of heightened language and Shakespeare was something that was part of Pinter's life from very early on. But he also, you know, was very prescient about what we would consider early modernism. So he was one of the first people we knew in England to be reading Franz Kafka and the surreal things about Kafka and the Kafkaesque world of terror and danger and strangeness when somebody wakes up and there's suddenly a cockroach or a knock on the door comes and you don't know why. Those kind of weird Kafkaesque going down the rabbit hole experiences, bureaucracy, faceless violence that comes from Kafka finds its way very quickly into Pinter's work. He was also one of the first people to discover Beckett. When Beckett's novels were published way before the plays, he took them out of the library and never returned them, and years later had to pay back the library in Hackney for taking out The Unnameable, which was one of his favorite things ever, which was one of Beckett's first novels. And he loved all those modernist films like Buñuel, things like that. So he was a very precocious child. But here's what's amazing. He never went to university. He only would have wanted to go to Oxford or Cambridge, and you had to have Latin. And he didn't have Latin. He hadn't gone to a fancy school. He didn't have the right education. And he was always very sorry that he hadn't gone to university. He was so unbelievably educated. In that way, he was very like Tom Stoppard, who was also a complete autodidact, taught himself everything. But never went to university and kind of regretted it later on, but kept reading and reading and reading. So Pinter is someone who read voraciously, always, but never went to university, so sort of learned on his own. And what happened to him is because he kind of fell in love with the theater, he decided at a young age that he was going to be an actor. And he very briefly went to RADA, to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. Now, I'm going to sidebar and say, so you understand the context, this is the 40s and 50s in England. So if you were an ordinary English theater goer, let us say, in that period, right after the war, or indeed during the war in England, what would you have seen on stage? Noel Coward, lots of it, Terence Rattigan, Oscar Wilde, that world of play, right? Elegant, upper middle class, beautifully spoken comedies where people were beautifully dressed, elegant scenery, lots of cigarettes and cocktails, and a kind of rarefied world, right? brilliant. And in many ways, Noel Coward, for instance, was a huge influence on Pinter, but very little that expressed anything political, very little drama, if any, that expressed the working classes in England. That just absolutely wasn't part. I mean, since Shakespeare, who had put all classes of humanity on stage, it had been a long time, or Ben Jonson, let's say, in the Renaissance, it had been a long time since the English working classes had had any voice at all on stage in England. And so this period of the 50s, the period right after the war, was a period of extraordinary upheaval in England on every level. So we have to realize it was sort of very opposite to America in a lot of ways. We won the war. The 50s in America was a period of incredible financial boom. We sent loads and loads of people who never would have gone to college on the GI Bill, at least men. I wouldn't say it was such a great period for women who had to go leave the workforce again and go back behind the picket fence, or certainly for non-white people. But the 50s in America spawned a certain kind of drama and a certain kind of literature of plenty. This was not the case really in England. First of all, rationing stayed in force in England until the mid-60s. So we're going to have to remember, when we read a play like The Birthday Party, where poor Meg is serving Petey cornflakes and fried bread, that things like breakfast cereal in a box, that was new in England and kind of amazing. But people were basically eating bread fried in fat for breakfast, and one egg, and no meat, and rationed sugar, and rationed coffee, and all of that. This is the era of the Elizabeth David cookbook, Mediterranean Cooking, where she tried to describe to people what olive oil was, and the one store in England you could go buy it, and that was exotic. So England was very poor. It was a period of rationing. It was a really tough financial period for working class English people after the war. The country had been heavily bombed. Lots and lots of neighborhoods that people had grown up in were razed to the ground and had to be rebuilt. Lots of London had to be rebuilt. It took a long time for England to come back. And then they rebuilt, you know, all of us have seen those 60s and 70s council flats, affordable living housing, really, really punishing situation that a lot of people had to live in. So that's kind of the environment that Pinter grew up in. And so it was also a period of political upheaval. There were the brown shirts. Oswald Mosley ran a fascist party. They marched through Hyde Park on a regular basis. Pinter said, as a young man, to look like a Jew or to go to a Jewish club was to put yourself in the line of fire and to really feel you were experiencing potential violence and opposition all the time, which meant you stayed with your tribe. He was very close to his family. He was brought up in a kind of legacy of British comedy, British humor that shows up over and over again in his plays, Yiddishisms and Jewish comedy. You know, I'll give you an example. When Goldberg gives his speech, his birthday toast in The Birthday Party, which we're going to read next week, he says, "But tonight, Lulu McCann, we've known a great fortune. We've heard a lady extend the sum total of her devotion in all its pride, plume, and peacock to a member of her own living race. Stanley, my heartfelt congratulations. I wish you, on behalf of us all, a happy birthday. I'm sure you've never been a prouder man than you are today. Mazel tov, and may we only meet at Simchas." So that was, you know, that's the kind of language that Pinter actually heard growing up in his family. Sort of the alliteration of pride, plume, and peacock, the Yiddishisms, Hebrew words, you know, studying the Bible, knowing Bible stories, and having a real attention being paid sort of to the family, to loyalty to the family was incredibly important. And also to trying to protect yourself as a Jew. So, for example, as I said, here are some tropes that come from that period that we're going to find over and over again. In the plays, the knock at the door. So this comes up in almost every Pinter play. Someone will feel safe in the room, and there's a knock, and strangers walk in. In the birthday party, it's Goldberg and McCann, the Jew and the Irishman walk into a bar. It's like a bad joke. They come in to harass Stanley. In the room, it's this couple, the kids, and there's Rose safe in her little room in her bed sit, and the knock on the door comes. It happens in The Caretaker. It happens over and over again. And for many years, people kept asking, what does it mean? Who are those strangers knocking on the door? How do we interpret it? The first person to ever write about Pinter in any way that people read widely, as I said, was my Stanford professor, Martin Esslin, who wrote a book called Theatre of the Absurd. And that's how he described Pinter's work, Ionesco's work, Beckett's work, lots of Arabal, lots of writers that came up in that period in the 50s and 60s. And because it wasn't conventional realism and it was quite mysterious to figure out what was really going on, he created this label, Theatre of the Absurd. Pinter hated this label because he said, no, my work is completely realistic. It's poetic maybe, but it's not absurd. It's absolutely real. So for him, I think it goes back to his experiences in the war. He didn't personally experience the Gestapo knocking on the door, but he certainly knew as he grew up that that was what was happening in Europe, that there was not a place where there were Jews anywhere in Europe, anywhere where they were hiding out, where the knock on the door didn't spell disaster. And so the arrival of strangers and the theme of the fortress being, breached, that is something that we're going to find over and over again as a theme in the plays, a very real theme in the plays. The weaponizing of language is another thing that comes up over and over again in Pinter. So I want to talk about this because it's so different from his American counterparts. And in order to do this, I want to read you something that he wrote himself in this essay that I think is so brilliant called Writing for the Theater, where he talks about the kind of language that he utilized. So he says, there is a kind of writer that trusts words, absolutely. I have mixed feelings, said Pinter, about words myself. Moving among them, sorting them out, watching them appear on the page. From this, I derive a considerable pleasure. But at the same time, I have another strong feeling about words, which amounts to nothing less than nausea. Such a weight of words confronts us day in, day out, words spoken in a context such as this lecture, words written by me and by others, the bulk of it a stale, dead terminology. Ideas endlessly repeated and permutated become platitudinous, trite, meaningless. So, he then says something that I find so moving. My characters tell me so much and no more with reference to their experience, their aspirations, their motives, their history. Between my lack of biographical data about them and the ambiguity of what they say lies a territory which is not only worthy of exploration, but which it is compulsory to explore. You and I, the characters which grow on a page, most of the time we're inexpressive, giving little away, unreliable, elusive, evasive, obstructive, unwilling. But it's out of those attributes that a language arises. A language, I repeat, where under what is said, another thing is being said. So unlike Americans who tend to believe that language is transparent, that meaning is easy to deduce, and that confession is a form of therapy and will be rewarded. In other words, if I tell the truth, I will be rewarded. Pinter's language is always elliptical, and telling the truth is always incredibly dangerous. So language is a smokescreen, a device, a game behind which you hide so that you don't reveal your own nakedness. So to go on in this essay, he says very famously, because remember, this is the writer who kind of created what we now call the Pinter pause, which he marked very frequently in his plays, and silence. He says in this same essay, there are two silences. One, when no word is spoken. The other, when perhaps a torrent of language is being employed. This speech is speaking of a language locked beneath it. That is its continual reference. The speech we hear is an indication of that which we don't hear. It is a necessary avoidance, a violent, sly, anguished, or mocking smokescreen, which keeps the other in its place. When true silence falls, we're still left with echo, but we are near nakedness. One way of looking at speech is to say that it is a constant stratagem to cover nakedness. And then he goes on to say there's invariably a moment in which a character does speak and reveal him or herself. And that is where all hell breaks loose. And in that moment, it's irretrievable and you can never take it back. So language is never casual in Pinter. It's like a weapon. And I would say his plays are always structured that there's predator and there's prey. It is not a safe world, even within that room. It's a world where your language is there to attack and defend, and you're always covering your back. And you see this over and over again, the way that characters use language to dominate. So I'll give you an example again, in the birthday party, which we're going to see next week. There's an interrogation and about something, which again comes from his Jewish background and has to do with naming. So naming something is pinning it, revealing it, exposing it. If you are scared that you're going to be revealed, you change your name. This is a very Jewish thing, and it has to do with passing. It also has to do with immigration. So lots of immigrants coming to, let us say, America and passing through Ellis Island had their names changed involuntarily. They might be Grunwald and they ended up Greenwald because that's what the immigration officer wrote down. But Jews often also deliberately changed their name in order to protect themselves from seeming Jewish so that they didn't get attacked by anti-Semites. And the main character in the birthday party is called Stanley Weber. And Goldberg and McCann, the antagonists, have this interrogation. Goldberg says, "Weber, why did you change your name?" And Stanley, who's terrified, says, "I forgot the other one." Goldberg says, "What's your name now?" Stanley, "Joe Soap." Goldberg says, "You stink of sin." McCann says, "I can smell it." Goldberg says, "Do you recognize an external force?" Stanley says, "What?" Goldberg repeats, "Do you recognize an external force?" McCann says, "That's the question." Goldberg repeats, "Do you recognize an external force responsible for you, suffering for you?" Stanley says, "It's late." Goldberg, late enough. When did you last pray?" McCann says, "He's sweating." Goldberg, "When did you last pray?" McCann, "He's sweating." Goldberg, "Is the number 846 possible or necessary?" Stanley says, "Neither." And the interrogation goes on like that. So you can imagine a Jew at the border being interrogated. Are you going to get let in? Or somebody who's trying to fight for their life, having to come up with what is being asked of them and how do they defend their very existence. So I would say one of the things that's always true about Pinter is the stakes are always incredibly high. Even if it seems like nothing, like somebody serving fried bread for breakfast, it's always kind of a life and death experience, because that is really, part of his language and part of his personal experience. Pinter, indeed, by the way, changed his own name when he became an actor. So when he was 17, he joined an Irish rep company that traveled all over the place, and he performed a different role every single week. And his stage name was David Baron, Baron. It was never entirely clear why he changed his name, because he certainly wasn't trying to make himself sound less Jewish. David Baron, if anything, is maybe a more Jewish name. He just thought it would help his role playing. And so much of his theater is about role playing, about pretending to be one thing or another all the time. So he played the role of actor David Baron, even though while he was in this rep company, he was also writing, and then he was Harold Pinter. And the time he finally decided to give up his name, his stage name, is in about 1965. He was acting Lenny in The Homecoming, and the poster said The Homecoming by Harold Pinter starring David Baron, but it was the same person, and he realized maybe he better give up David Baron and just be Harold Pinter. But name changing and role playing comes out of his own life experience, and that's going to be a big part of his oeuvre. The other thing is that he writes about a lot, and we're going to read it in his famous play Betrayal, is that fundamental human action of betraying your family, your lover, your tribe. And this sort of starts for Pinter when he marries Vivian Merchant. So while he's in rep, he first has an Irish girlfriend named Pauline Flanagan. He brings her home to meet his parents. His parents, who were Orthodox Jews, were absolutely appalled and had no interest in Pinter staying with Pauline Flanagan or marrying her, because they felt they had to sort of maintain their Jewish history and protect their tribe. He then married Vivian Merchant, who was also not Jewish. And an even bigger crime is that he went to a registry office and married her on Yom Kippur. Really bad. And his family was desperately upset. When we read The Homecoming, we're going to read a play about a man who betrays his family and marries a shiksa, marries someone not Jewish, and flees the wrath of his family. And what happens to this character, whose name is Teddy in the play, when he brings Ruth, his wife, Ruth, who has a Jewish name in the play, back to meet his family, and how they get revenge on him for having betrayed them. So the theme of betrayal, which is a deep and biblical one, and believe me, Pinter knew the Bible and knew the father and son stories and the Abraham and Isaac stories and what it was to betray God and negotiate with God and have to rectify your betrayal. These things were very important in the dramaturgy. And the notion of marrying out of the faith, which Pinter did twice, comes up over and over again in his work. And I think, was something that he was very nervous about because he loved his parents so much. So as I said, he joins this acting company in the 50s and he goes to Ireland, where he works in the company of this guy called Mac Wolf. And they are actor managers, the people who run these companies. And a couple of things are really important to know about that time. First of all, he was a wonderful actor, Pinter. I saw him act. He acted all through his life. Rather frightening and quite... what do I want to say? Very theatrical as an actor. He loved to act with his back to an audience. He had a big, rich baritone voice, beautiful speech. So he acted in a lot of Shakespeare. He always played the villain. He played Iago a number of times, for example. But he was also in a lot of Agatha Christie, things like that, thrillers. And the reason I bring this up is that we think of Pinter as being so avant-garde, and he was in a way, very influenced by Beckett, let's say. And on the other hand, he knew better than anybody how conventional theater worked, how dramaturgy worked. He knew how Agatha Christie wrote a blackout line. He knew that if you black out the stage and in the dark you hear somebody scream, the audience will jump out of their seats. So sound was really important to him, making sound scary to an audience. So for instance, in the top of the second act of The Birthday Party, we're sitting in a blackout in the audience and you hear this really terrifying sound and you don't know what it is. And when the lights come up, McCann, the Irish thug, is tearing a newspaper into 5 equal strips. And it goes right through you. It's so scary. And you don't really know why. You think, why is that a scary sound, newspaper tearing? And as always with Pinter, it's the how, it's the what, not the why. We don't know why, we just experience the what, which is something violent is happening. So he learned this from Agatha Christie. What happens, where's the corpse on the ground? Or what if the corpse is never on the ground? Or, sounds of things like doors slamming or the stranger walking in the door, or how a lighting effect, thunder, lightning, strobe lights could terrify an audience or wake them up, or etc. So he deeply understood craft, the nature of craft. If you're performing in rep, which means you're rehearsing one play all day and performing another play every single day for 12 weeks, you have to really know what you're doing. You have to rely on your craft. You have to learn to memorize incredibly quickly, and you have to figure out how to play an audience. And Pinter knew how to do all those things. He also, in rep, always stayed in these really terrible digs, they called them, bed and breakfast, So The Birthday Party, Meg, is modeled on this slag of a woman who was ran this filthy kind of terrible bed and breakfast. And interestingly, he wrote about her in a letter to a friend of his, all about this terrifying bed and breakfast that he stayed in, where she sling eggs at him and hid this man upstairs. And he always wondered who that man was who came down, and that was going to become Stanley in The Birthday Party. Just to answer, I'm not sure who this is, but about Pinter's name being anglicized. Here's what's funny. Yes, it was anglicized from the Russian, but because the name isn't Russian or Ukrainian, but that's what his grandparents were. He claimed for a while that he was a Spanish Jew and that his name was Da Pinta. That was never proved, but he wanted to say he was a Sephardic Jew, interestingly. But he did have religious lessons for his bar mitzvah, yes. So he was bar mitzvahed. He was part of a synagogue in Hackney, and he certainly, then he kind of fell away from religion and didn't pretend later on to celebrate. And yet I feel like so many basic images from the Bible, as I say, the sense of language of the testaments, of the way of Moses's negotiations with God, of the plagues, of violence, and all of those things, of ritual, of hiding things, of the afikomen that the youngest child hides in Passover, and the rituals of the Passover service. Or Elijah, in the homecoming, there's a very funny thing where Lenny says, "We always leave a place outside for you, Teddy," at the empty seat, right? Which comes up over and over again. This is a question from Matt saying, was Pinter a socialist? Which is a really good question. I mean, I would say more than a socialist, Pinter was always sort of an anarchist. I think the war left him very bitter, not only about fascism, but about government in general, about war in general. He was definitely a pacifist. He was bitterly opposed to Bush's invasion of Iraq. This was something he couldn't get over, that he wrote about endlessly. He thought it was completely unnecessary, but he also felt this way about the British government. Remember that he came of age 1956, the Suez Canal, the loss of the British Empire, but the lies of the British Empire, the Falkland War that came after that, British militarism. He was sort of violently opposed to. He particularly reserved much of his wrath for Margaret Thatcher. He thought her government was hateful, and when she said there is no society, there are only individual human beings, that to Harold Pinter was the beginning of the end. You have to remember he grew up in a neighborhood. He was a deep believer in society and in community and in fighting for your community and your neighborhood and your tribe and believing in all of those things. And instead, along comes Thatcher. And aside from the fact that, she decimated the healthcare system in many ways, and then she privatized, the trains, the mines, etc. Pinter felt that British society and the British language was being sort of torn apart. So I would say, I don't know that he was a self-identified socialist, and many people made fun of him later because he married his second marriage after Vivian Merchant, and he got divorced and she died of alcohol poisoning, a very sad and tragic episode in his life. And he wrote Ruth for her in the homecoming, and she was, Vivian Merchant, his muse. He then married Lady Antonia Fraser, who was the daughter of Hugh Fraser, not a Tory, but a very wealthy member of the House of Lords. And and she comes from, and is still alive and kicking, a very elegant but very lefty family. So they were kind of called Bollinger Bolshevists, or limousine liberals. They were very lefty. They had a very anti-Thatcher lefty think tank in their home in Regent's Park. But many people made mock of Pinter because he married someone so rich and elegant, and then he carried on, with the British left. It was a source of conflict between him and Tom Stoppard. Tom grew up much poorer in many ways, or as poor as Pinter, did not necessarily marry money, made money, Stoppard, but was much more conservative politically. And so although they admired each other and enjoyed playing cricket together, politically they were on very different ends of the political spectrum. And later on, Pinter wrote a lot of very charged political plays about torture and about the way the British government used torture in various political environments. He wrote a very brilliant one-act called One for the Road, which is a play about the banality of torture, a really kind of extraordinary play. So the context in which, while he was there doing this kind of tour of Ireland, playing in really little theaters all over the British Isles and also in Wales, English theater in London was changing radically. And here are a few things that were changing that paved the way for a writer like Harold Pinter to emerge. In the 50s emerged what we now call the angry young men writers, but the main one was John Osborne, and he wrote a play in 1956 called Look Back in Anger, which exploded British drama. If you read it now, it's hard to understand that it was so radical, or it was so influential, because to our eyes now, it's quite a conventional play in terms of its structure. It's a realistic play that takes place in a bedsit where a young guy and his girlfriend meet and fight and argue and break up and come back together. Harold Pinter acted in the play later on, played the best friend. It's also quite a misogynistic play. The women are kind of there to be screwed and don't have much agency of their own. But it was performed at the Royal Court, which was where all the major new theater was emerging in the 50s on Sloane Square, this amazing theater, new theater. And it just blew the roof off because it was violent and working class. And the kinds of anxieties that Jimmy, a porter, that's the name of the character in Look Back in Anger, evinced. This kind of rage against the machine, rage against the hypocrisy of the government, rage against pretentious, wealthy English public school attitudes towards the world. This had never been seen in the English theater really since Shakespeare. This kind of... and even then, I mean, it was hard to describe what it felt like to sit in that audience and to experience those characters who were not elegant cigarette smoking, martini drinking Noel Coward characters, but were just angry, violent, young men. Then along came Beckett's Waiting for Godot, also in 1956, which also blew the roof off the English theater because nobody had ever encountered anything like it. It was described as a play where nothing happens twice. So, it seemed completely existential. Indeed, it was actually based on Beckett's own wartime experience, running code in the south of France as a partisan, trying to defeat the Nazis, hiding out in scary trenches in the Vaucluse, waiting to pass code and not ever knowing if the person you were waiting for was going to show up. So, from Beckett's own point of view, it was quite realistic, but from the world's point of view, it was these two tramps sitting there having random dialogue and eating turnips and waiting for somebody named Godot to turn up. And then a little boy would come and say, Mr. Godot told me to tell you he's not coming today, but surely tomorrow. What did it mean? It was life-changing. Peter Hall, who then directed all of Pinter's work, directed it in London, and it was a kind of extraordinary moment. The other thing that was going on in England at that same period, Brecht came. So Mother Courage arrives also in the mid-50s. So this kind of amazing political theater where people sang songs in the middle of a play and talked directly to the audience and tried to wake them up to the injustices of the world. That had never happened and was very influential. And also American musicals. Again, very working class musicals like Oklahoma, that put characters on stage that had never been part of the American musical and that were, poor people striving to make better of their lives. So all of that was happening. And at the same time, we have to remember that in England, the only way to get a play produced before that was to have it done in the commercial theater, because there wasn't any alternative. And suddenly, in the period, in the 50s and 60s, these new forms of subsidized theater started to emerge, like the Royal Court, that wasn't commercial, that people had memberships in, but that were not, purely West End theaters. And universities started having their own theaters. So Bristol University, where Pinter's very first play, The Room, was directed by his old Jewish friend, Henry Wolfe, that was just done in a kind of classroom setting almost, in the theater department of Bristol University. Bristol still has an incredibly important drama department with very important theater programs, and it's where many, many major people began their theatrical careers. And when Tom Stoppard wanted to begin his theatrical career, he started as a journalist in Bristol, writing reviews of Peter O'Toole in productions at the Bristol Old Vic, and seeing, Harold Pinter at Bristol University. So that was very important. There were suddenly places, not very many, but some. The Edinburgh Fringe was another one, the Edinburgh Festival, where plays by new writers showing you new ways of working were being put in front of new audiences, new producing models. And this allowed plays like The Birthday Party or The Homecoming or the plays of Tom Stoppard to begin to emerge. There had never been anything like that before. This was the beginning, the itty bitty beginning of Britain's National Theatre, which was founded by Laurence Olivier, and it was in London, but way before they built the big brutalist building on the South Bank that we all go to now as the National Theatre. It was housed in the Old Vic, on the South Bank in London, where you can still go today. But the idea was that there should be a place where you could do real repertoire with trained actors that didn't close on the following Sunday if it didn't get a good review in the London Times, and that wasn't purely dependent on commercial success. The idea that theater should be repertoire that was sustained, both classical and new plays, kept alive by new young audiences with cheap theater tickets. This was really revolutionary, had not happened before. And if it hadn't been for the National Theatre and then the Royal Shakespeare Company, where many of Pinter's plays, ironically, were first premiered, we never would have had these writers, and not just Pinter and Stoppard, but all of the young playwrights, David Hare, for example, Howard Brenton, Edward Bond, Carol Churchill, Joan Littlewood, who ran her own very radical theater in the East End of London, Stephen Burkhoff, who created his own very radical new theater in the East End of London. These small, new, sort of for the people institutions were what allowed new playwriting to emerge. And that's kind of how Pinter, for example, found his way into the possibility of creating a new kind of dramaturgy. And here's what's so amazing about Pinter. When he wrote The Room, he wrote it for his friend Henry Wolfe, who said, oh, the students have a slot and we have a room, and if you send me a play in 6 months or in 3 months or something, I'll produce it. And Pinter said, I could never write it that fast. And in 2 weeks, he sent it to him. And he wrote it while he was in rep in Ireland. The Room is set in a room, and it's a woman named Rose and her really violent, creepy husband, Bert, who just keeps eating fried eggs and driving off in his van and saying terrible homophobic, racist things. And then this couple who comes to visit, and in the end, a Black man whom you think is her father, he arrives. He wrote this play, and it was already absolutely sui generis Harold Pinter. And, that kind of thing is very hard to ever explain. How does a writer find his voice? The same thing happened with Tom Stoppard, that when he first wrote Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, he's 29 years old. You'd never mistake it for anybody else's writing. So, I guess it's just the sign of a genius. It's quite fascinating. But already that happened. So, this man who'd never been to university, been an actor, very poor, could never make ends meet, didn't have 2 cents to put together, writes this play, The Room. It's put on but at the Bristol Vic. It gets reviewed by Harold Hobson in London, and British theater is never the same. So on that note, I'm going to give you a little break. It's, what is it, 1:59. So let's take like 5-6 minutes. Why don't we come back at, 2:05, something like that. And then we'll keep going. And stick anything you would like to know in the chat. More than happy to answer it. Okay? Whoops, there we are. Okay. One other sort of larger thematic thing, which is going to come up over and over again in the plays, and then I'm going to talk to you about some things to watch out for now as you read the plays, was Pinter's obsession, I would say, with the past. And I don't quite know why this is, except that he had a traumatic childhood, but a childhood he loved very much. And he was always trying to scroll back through that time in his life to remember. He's very suspicious about whether we as human beings can ever accurately talk about our past or anybody else's past. And I say this because in American theater, the biography of a character is very important. Again, I'm referring to, let's say, the golden age of American theater, whether that's O'Neill and Tennessee Williams or Arthur Miller, that you, as a playwright, write out the biography of your character. You know what's happened to them before the play begins. It is the job of the actor to create a complex and fully formed biography of the character they're playing, to know what they ate for breakfast, to know where they walk in the street, to know what kind of clothes they wear, to create this full-blooded character that arrives on stage at the start of a play. Pinter did not believe in that. He didn't believe in that in a very kind of profound existential way about life or about theater. In other words, he felt that human beings were endlessly mysterious, and that you only kind of caught glimpses, like a cubist painting, of the surface of a character, as if you were meeting somebody on a bus. So imagine you overhear a conversation between two people on a bus, a man and a woman, and you're thinking, are they lovers? Is it a brother and a sister? Are they parent and children? Have they ever met before? What's their history? You have to listen, and you try to put something together, but it's a mystery. That's how he wrote his plays. He did not start his plays knowing what the history of each character was and how to itemize it in any kind of way. What he did was, according to his own testimony, was find two characters sitting in a room and just start to listen to them talk. Now, obviously, he's crafting it. He was the master craftsman, but he never manipulated his characters into saying things or representing things that he wanted them to say, or trying to come out with a plot point that didn't feel natural. He always thought, listen and intuit and guess, and you can't know more than the character knows. So he wrote this thing in his essay. Again, this is an essay that's in this book, Writing for the Theater, that I think is so beautiful and really central to his work. He says, apart from any other consideration, we are faced with the immense difficulty, if not the impossibility, of verifying the past. I don't mean merely years ago, but yesterday, this morning. What took place? What was the nature of what took place? What happened? If one can speak of the difficulty of knowing what in fact took place yesterday, one can, I think, treat the present in the same way. What is happening now? We won't know until tomorrow or 6 months' time. And we won't know then. We'll have forgotten, or our imagination will have attributed quite false characteristics to today. A moment is sucked away and distorted, even often at the time of its birth. So, for example, when the lovers are fighting in Betrayal, he says, don't you remember? I picked up your daughter and I threw her up in your kitchen. And she stops and says, no, it was my kitchen. And they can't even remember or share an agreement about the facts of a memory that was the beginning of their love affair. And of course, that's a sign in the play that the love is starting to fragment, that they don't even share a memory. So the past is very elusive in Pinter. And when a character walks on stage, you have to listen to what they say and try and guess what's true without ever knowing whether in fact it actually happened. The way it works is that someone talks about the past as a way to weaponize the present. So, for example, in the birthday party, when you read the birthday party for next week, you're going to find that Stanley, the main character, is a man hiding out upstairs, scared to death that someone's going to come take him away. So you think, is he a criminal? Is he a Jew? What's the crime? Why is he hiding out there? When did he come? Meg says he's been there a year. Why? So finally, he gives this monologue, one of the great monologues in theater, about giving a concert. And he said he used to be a pianist, and Meg describes it to Goldberg. She says they were all there that night, and he was supposed to play the piano. And then, as Stanley said, they locked the place up, and then he couldn't, and he ran away. And you think, is this somebody's paranoid memory? Is it a nervous breakdown? Was he indeed a musician? Was he a pianist? who played famous things. He says he played in Zagreb and Vladivostok. Is that true? She thinks it's true. What does it tell you? And of course, it's heartbreaking because you don't have to know whether it really happened. What you have to see is that you have a broken man who's trying to impress the woman who's his surrogate mother with a past that he may or may not ever have had. This happens over and over again in Pinter, where the past comes back to bite you. We're going to find in old times that a couple, Dealey and Kate, are terrified about the past because in the past, she, Kate, lived with a woman named Anna, and they shared underwear. What does it mean? We don't know. Were Anna and Kate lovers? Were they just best friends? Why won't Kate ever tell Dealey what happened between them? And then suddenly, Anna is the stranger. There's a knock on the door. She's really already in the house. Anna walks in, and she totally upends and destroys this marriage. Why? Who is she? What was the past? Well, the play is about Dealey's terror that something happened in the past which he can't control. We don't need to verify what happened. All we need to do is detonate the secret, and it will play out in the present. Do you see what I mean? So in Pinter, we always have to look at what is the present tense event happening between two people, a betrayal, a lie, an invention that makes a relationship, a marriage, a friendship start to fall apart. And how does the main character who's being threatened get it back? And it often has to do with this very uneasy, slippery relationship to somebody describing their own past. And I will just say tangentially that one of the most beautiful things Pinter ever wrote was a screenplay for Proust's great novel, Remembrance of Things Past. The screenplay never got produced. It's too expensive. It was too elusive, but it's incredibly beautiful. And it tells us a lot about Pinter, because what is Proust about? It's totally in reductive terms, that moment when the Madeleine cookie gets dipped in the tea and he tastes the Madeleine, and in tasting it, his entire childhood comes back in the most extraordinary ways to haunt the character of Marcel, the young man, from whose point of view the whole book is written. And Pinter loved Proust, loved that, and completely understood that the past is always the present, that a little thing will remind you, a sound, a taste of a cookie, a smell, and suddenly you're there back in the past, reliving that that entire thing. Let me just see. Sorry, somebody's asking, do I encourage actors to construct the past their characters believed happened? It's a great question. And here's the thing. When we were first, and I'm going to tell you this next week when we worked on the birthday party, when we were in the room with Pinter, we asked him all kinds of questions because we had the playwright. We thought, amazing, he's finally going to explain the play. So we would say, for example, what did Stanley do? Did he really commit a crime? Why is he there? Pinter would, said, I don't know. Pinter, as a director or actor, only knew what was on the page. He never acted like he was the omniscient playwright. And you'd say something like, why does Meg keep asking Petey to read her the newspaper? What does that tell you about their relationship? Is it that they have a bad marriage? What does it tell you? Why does she keep asking? And Pinter would say, I believe she's forgotten how to read, which I always thought was such a fantastic note, because what it told you is Meg forgets everything. Moment to moment, scene to scene, she can't remember what she did the day before. And so she doesn't carry things with her, arguments or fears or anything. Every day is new because she's a complete innocent. She plays the same games with her husband every day. I bet you don't know what this is. Yes, I do. What is it then? Fried bread. That's right, she says, thrilled that he'd remember, but he had fried bread yesterday. She doesn't remember. So he did not encourage us to create a biography. What he did encourage actors to do was listen with acute attention to everything that a character said in the moment and what that told you about who they were. So Petey in the birthday party, small character, he's a chess player. Pinter would keep saying, remember that. Petey plays chess, or he puts out deck chairs in all weathers in the morning. What does that tell you? He's a loner. He's sort of a strategist. He makes moves. Those things tell you a lot about who he is and how he's going to function in the play. He's a gardener. He grows his peas outside. And Pinter was very, very attuned to things like that. Or I would say in the party scene, there's something wrong with this scene, Harold. It doesn't really feel tense enough to me. And he'd say, I would urge you to remember that Irishmen always drink alone. And what he meant is I'd made it a little too convivial, that I should pull McCann away, let him sit alone with his whiskey. So he was meticulous about what he called the facts of the scene. The facts, like this is an Irishman, he's drinking whiskey in a party where there's only one exit, so you can't escape, and the lights go out, and there's a flashlight, and there's somebody who wears glasses. He's very attuned to things like who can't see. So a fact of the birthday party is that Stanley is almost blind. And so to break Stanley's glasses is the ultimate act of destruction. Those things he was meticulous about. What he called the facts of the scene, and also what he thought of as the stage magic. We're going to talk about this a lot. His props are like magic tricks, like the drum. The drum has to smash when Stanley steps on it, but it can't smash when Meg plays it in part one. So it's a magic prop. How do you build it? So his eyes are tuned to that. He didn't ever want to waste time on psychology or sort of theorizing about the characters. Now, in part, I think it's because he was an actor in rep. He had to get those plays up week to week. You didn't have time. But he also thought that was an imposition on the characters. He would always say, when you meet somebody new, he walked into a room with me. There were things we could sniff about each other. We were both Central European Jews. We had the same frame of reference. We laughed at the same things. We understood name changing. There are things we sort of understood, but he didn't know anything about me and my life, and he didn't ask. He didn't think that was his business. So it's a very different thing from rehearsing, let us say, a Tennessee Williams play, right? If you play Amanda in the Glass Menagerie, you are given a set of biographical details about her past, and you're not asked to question them. When she talks about, or let's say when Blanche talks about being a Southern belle and all the men who came to her plantation and sat on the veranda, you take that as true. That's part of Blanche's background. This is never the case in Pinter. In Pinter, the past is elusive. And when people talk about their past, it's to weaponize it and bring something forward to the present. And so you have to kind of be careful of what you believe. What it means is that the plays are like athletic events, meaning that you are always on your front foot and you're always there to figure out what is the action of a line. In that regard, and I'm going to talk more about this as we go along, but in thinking about casting and who does well in a Pinter play, it's very hard to act Pinter. You have to have a great command of language. And I know it's such a cliche that there are no small roles, there are only small actors, but in Pinter, it's true for this reason. It's like casting a jazz quartet where every character gets their solo. So in the birthday party, I want you to notice when you read it, that Petey seems like the marginal character. He's an old man. He doesn't have a lot to say. It's not very florid. He leaves for the whole party. He's not even in Act 2. But when it comes time for him, like a jazz musician, to play his solo, you better have a great actor who plays that role, because he has to deliver it. It's an incredibly meticulous kind of virtuosic performance. So there's something really beautiful and I think gratifying about acting in a Pinter play, which is you're part of a sports team. Here I want to stress that Pinter loved games. This cannot be said enough. He was such an obsessive cricket player that he wouldn't come to rehearsal if there was a major test match going on, because he just had to watch it, on television, or if he possibly could, he had to go live, because cricket was his life. And he loved all kinds of games. You're going to see when we read The Birthday Party that he loved charades and he loved blind man's buff. In Betrayal, they play games. In old times, they play games. They also play old music. He loved crooners and Bing Crosby and Sinatra, and kind of the music of his youth, and that music comes up over and over again. But game playing, setting up the rules and then playing the game, was something that Pinter loved, and it meant if you lost the game, you lost the game, and you better be ready for round two. He was competitive. The plays, that's why the plays are so alive. They're completely theatrical because they're all, you play it to win, and they all take place in an enclosed space. And the space is like a boxing ring. So I'm going to talk about this a lot when we do the birthday party, when we do the homecoming. When you do a Pinter play, you have to think, what is the enclosure that those boxers, those wrestlers, those athletes are caught in? And how do you set it up? You have to be very careful that movement is not only permitted, but encouraged in a Pinter play. This is why it is not realism. And by this, I mean, very often in a realistic play, and by a realistic play, let's say we're talking about, what's one we would all know, Death of a Salesman, which is actually not a very realistic play. It's kind of expressionistic. It has all kinds of other strange things going on. But let's say it's in a given room, where you know what the main space is, and you know where Biff and Happy's room is, or that kind of thing, or the Glass Menagerie, where they're in Amanda's front room, and then there's a balcony off, and that across the street from the balcony is that club where you're seeing lights flash, where they're playing music. So you sort of know what the landscape is, and you can explode it or not. In Pinter, he describes the room, and you cannot clutter it up with realistic details, because it's like being in a boxing ring where you have to have access to your enemy. So what you learn is everything that's in the room. Brecht said this, and I always love this. Brecht said, everything in the room, you don't have to have all of reality in the room, but everything in the room has to be real. So what Brecht meant is, Brecht sets were very spare, but let's say you had somebody sawing wood. It had to be a real saw and real wood. You couldn't fake it and pretend a character was doing that, but they weren't. It had to be real. And Pinter really learned that from Brecht. So the things that are there, I'll go back to the image of the eyeglasses. There's a terrifying moment in the second act of the birthday party where McCann, who's the villain, takes those glasses off Stanley's face and snaps them. The sound of the snap is like Stanley's bones breaking. It is his mind snapping. He will never be the same. So that prop is extremely important. It's epiphanic, it's iconic. You can't just pick any old pair of eyeglasses and assume it's going to work. You have to construct them. It's the newspaper is like that. You think, oh, it's just a newspaper. Go home one day and try as an exercise taking the New York Times or whatever you read, the Chronicle, and stripping it into equal strips. Most newspapers don't strip that way. You have to have the right newspaper. You have to score it. And most people today don't even take a newspaper. So, this is going to all be history soon. And you have to figure out how to make that sound with the newspaper ripping. When we did it at the Geary's too loud. You couldn't hear the sound. We had to put a kind of mic on a thread up the sleeve of Marco Baricelli, the actor, so that as he ripped the paper, you'd hear it going up the mic and the audience would hear it going through them and be terrified. You can't take any of those things for granted. So you have to make the experience feel real, but it's all theatrical, So it drove him crazy in rehearsal. If you'd sit around the way you might in a Tennessee Williams or in an Arthur Miller play, talking about where did somebody go to school, or what was the nature of this relationship? Or, for example, the question came up over and over again, have Goldberg and McCann met Stanley? Why are they there? Well, you have to start, as I said, with the existential thing, that this is a play that grew out of war. And in the time of the Second World War, anybody who was considered an enemy of the state, and we all know it wasn't just Jews, it was gay people and gypsies and political and communists and radicals, and all kinds of people were deemed unacceptable, disabled people. And they were on the list. And if you were on the list and you counted as an undesirable, the knock on the door was coming for you. So in a way, you couldn't always even identify why it happened. And for Pinter, it's much more frightening that you don't identify it. So while it's helpful to know the context in which the plays are written, it's also really important to look at how real the character's terror is in the present moment, rather than trying to kind of set it up in such a way that you know what happened to them in the scene before. The other thing Pinter would always say is, just like a sports event, like let's say it's like a tennis match, every game starts clean from zero. Obviously, it all adds up to something, and if you lose 6 games, you lose the match. But you have to, in a way, play Pinter the way you would play a sports match. I was thinking about this watching tennis this weekend, that, you know, a tennis player is a strategist, and you have to forget that you lost the match before and start clean and see if you can start over again. So it's a very different kind of acting. It's very athletic in a way, I would say. It's also very hard to learn Pinter's lines, because the language is distilled and poetic and frightening, and often an interrogation. And if you forget where you are, the context is not going to help you, and you can't paraphrase it. And when Pinter was with us in the room in New York, he would just laugh out loud when an actor like Peter Riekert was doing the interrogation and he just forgot what the next line was. And Pinter knew exactly what that felt like because he'd written it, and it's really hard to get it back. So you have to be very nimble, I would say, and supple in Pinter to remember what's going on, you know, moment to moment. And Pinter, you know, himself acted in a lot of his plays, directed a lot of his plays, and also directed other plays in which he used his own sort of techniques. So one play he directed that I saw in London very brilliantly was 12 Angry Men. You remember that? I mean, very conventional play about 12 jurors who have to decide whether somebody is guilty. It's kind of your ultimate procedural, but Pinter did 2 things I'll never forget when he directed it. And this tells you how he thought as a theater artist. He was very fond of slowing things down so that you would see in the pauses, in the silence, in the interstices, something that might be a clue for you of what was really going on. And he also was fond of sort of heightening the language. So something would get said that you didn't think was an important thing, and later you'd look back and think, oh, I should have remembered that. And that had to do with stillness on stage and where the audience's eyes were being directed. So in a naturalistic play, we're going to talk about this a lot when we talk about staging. If you've ever read sort of the Bible on which contemporary naturalistic plays are staged, is Stanislavski's An Actor Prepared. Stanislavski was a great, famous Russian theater, first actor, then director, then theorist. He wrote a lot of books about making theater. He was the first to direct Chekhov. So when we think about Chekhov, we think about Stanislavski. And he had a big influence because he was part of the Moscow Art Theater that came to America in the 30s. He had a big influence on American playwrights like Clifford Odets, all that great early period, and then later Inge and O'Neill and, you know, the later writers. But that kind of amazing ensemble-based realist acting that was very detailed and not melodramatic and heartbreaking came from Stanislavski in the Moscow Art Theater. So it was very psychological and sort of meticulously done. And there were, you know, Stanislavski sort of prescribed certain ways that a rehearsal should be run. And in Pinter often subverts that and defies certain things that Stanislavski was very fond of. One thing Stanislavski loved to think about, and it really works, is for actors to think about what he called a secondary action. So let's say you're sitting there on Zoom right now and you're listening to me speak, but you might also be drinking a cup of coffee. You might also be taking notes. You might also be looking at the clock. You might also be turning aside to talk to your partner who's listening with you to make a comment on it. That's a secondary action. And Stanislavski felt that that gave a play texture and realism, right? Because it was like real life. In Pinter, he likes to strip it away so you don't have a secondary action. For example, he never wanted an actor to walk and talk at the same time. I know this sounds insane, but talking is a form of walking is a form of language, right? If I'm sitting here talking to you, if I pull my chair back like this and I stand up, that is a form of aggression or shift or scenic shift that is very big in Pinter. And he felt, don't waste it, right? Either you have language that's active or physical life that's active, but don't do it at the same time. That's the same thing with silence and stillness. So in Pinter, the characters can be very still and suddenly they move. And these are sort of the rules of play that I learned in working with Pinter that at first seemed very peculiar to me. And I thought, wait a minute, what is he talking about? But actually, if you followed those rules of play, you would understand, for example, what a pause really was. At first, you just had to shut up and be quiet. You didn't know what it was. And soon you'd realize what he meant. A pause is a bridge between two thoughts. And a silence is when there's no bridge, when the bottom just drops off, out of something, that awful moment you're with somebody and they say something or you say something and there's nothing more to be said, right? And the bottom drops out and you think that's the truth. And often in Pinter, there'll be one time where a character tells the truth like that. And it can never be sort of, I don't know, what do I want to say, reclaimed or redeemed? Because once something like that is said, the world shifts. And in the silence, it shifts. So look very carefully when you look at The Birthday Party at how he uses silence and how he uses pauses. Particularly, I would urge you to look at the silences and pauses marked when Goldberg speaks, because Goldberg is an example of what I read to you about Pinter, that there's never, that silence can either be a torrent of language or the absence of language. Goldberg never stops talking. It's so scary. He's so violent and so vicious. And when he does finally stop talking and there's a silence, you realize he understands he's a completely hollow man. And it only happens for 1 second in part 3. So I'm going to stop and see if there's anything that you would particularly like to throw in the chat or ask. I would look at your hands going up, but I can't see all of you. I guess I could do a different view to see all of you in, yeah, there you go. But if any of you have anything you want to ask about what to look at before you go off and read The Birthday Party, I'm happy to answer it.
Students, I enabled your microphone, so you should be able to unmute yourself
Great.
as well if you wanted to ask a question. I see someone.
Go ahead.
Go ahead and I see that you're unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question. This gentleman in the green shirt, sorry, I can't pronounce your name. It says GFBJR.
Hi.
That's by accident.
I'm GFBJR, I think, but I don't have a question. Must have been an accident.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Matt
Ginsberg, do you want to go
Ginsberg?
ahead? Yeah.
Where's Matt? Matt had a question. Yeah, hi.
Hi. So my question is, Pinter style is very unique. What were the primary criticisms of him? I would guess that critics attacked him at least from time to time. What were the main criticisms? If you can...
Oh, you have no idea. When The Birthday Party premiered, it got such terrible reviews that it closed in 5 performances. And when he went to see it on the final matinee and snuck up into the balcony, the usher asked who he was. He said, "I'm the writer." She said, "Oh, you poor man." So the main criticism is that the plays were impenetrable. People said, what did they mean? They didn't explain themselves. They didn't have a biography of a character that was clear. The language was elliptical. Suddenly characters, there are things in the interrogation you'll see in The Birthday Party where McCann suddenly yells at Stanley, "What about the Albigensionist heresy?" And you think, the what? So the criticism was that it was not realistic, that we didn't understand who these people were, that we didn't know why they were taking Stanley away. We didn't understand where they were taking Stanley. What had Stanley done that was so bad that he had to be taken away? And why did the playwright not explain what the play meant? That is the main criticism. And Pinter, for his part, wrote really vociferously. I mean, I'll read you one quick thing that I think is so important about Pinter. he said, a character on the stage who can present no convincing argument or information as to his past experience, his present behavior, or his aspirations, nor give a comprehensive analysis of his motives, is as legitimate and as worthy of attention as one who alarmingly can do all of these things. The more acute the experience, the less articulate its expression. And I just love that, but people just didn't know what to make of it. So that was the main criticism. You know, what are you doing to us, and why can't why can't we understand it?
Thank you.
Anything else you're curious about or that seemed confusing that came up before you go off and tackle the birthday party for yourselves? As I say, this you can find it collected anywhere. What we're going to do next week is just start by so here's what I'm saying to you. If you, for one reason or another, can't find the play or can't read it, come anyway, totally fine. I'm going to give you just a quick overview of what happens in the play. I'm going to give you some images, some slides of our production, of what it looked like and how it was done. But you can also YouTube it, and you can find that strange William Friedkin film or anything else you want to look at. And then we're going to talk about it thematically and linguistically, and then some strategies of how would you cast it, how would you design it, how do you play those scenes, and what really happens at the end of the play. So don't worry if you read it and you're mystified. I would encourage you actually to read it out loud because it's so hilariously funny. Jackie is saying the play is available online, so that may be true, and go hunt around. I'm sure you'll find it. Okay, have a wonderful week. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Thanks again, Professor, for a great first class, and thank you, students, for joining us. We'll see you all next time.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.